The man sits cross-legged on a wooden floor, a single oil lamp casting uneven light across a game board in front of him. The pieces are hand-carved, the room smells of cedar and smoke. Outside, somewhere past a paper screen and a garden wall, a war is either approaching or receding. He isn't sure. He moves a piece. His opponent considers the position for a long time. Neither man speaks. This is not a warrior in repose. This is a warrior doing exactly what he is supposed to be doing. The popular image of the samurai leaves almost no room for the hours between battles. We see the armor, the sword, the rigid posture, the rigid code. What we rarely see is the game board, the inkstone, the fishing line dropped into still water, the calligraphy brush moving slowly across paper. We don't see the dice, the sake cup tilted between two retainers who have been waiting for orders for 3 weeks and have run out of things to say. The samurai, in most modern depictions, exist only in moments of peak intensity, drawing a blade, issuing a command, facing death with theatrical composure. What happened the rest of the time tends to disappear. But there was a rest of the time, a lot of it, in fact. Samurai who served lords in castle towns during the relative stability of the Edo period, which ran from the early 17th century through the mid-19th, might go their entire careers without drawing a sword in anger. Even warriors who served during the more chaotic periods of the Sengoku era, the century of near-constant civil war that preceded Edo, spent far more hours in camp, on the road, or in garrison than they ever spent in actual combat. Time had to be filled. Bodies and minds had to be maintained. And the ways samurai filled that time reveal something important about who they actually were, as opposed to who later tradition decided they should have been. Start with the game board. Shogi, a board game that resembles chess in its basic logic, but differs significantly in its rules and captured piece mechanics, was widespread among samurai by the medieval period. Records suggest it was played casually at multiple levels of the warrior hierarchy, from high-ranking retainers in castle quarters to lower-ranked soldiers passing time during garrison duty. The game required no equipment that couldn't be carried, no infrastructure beyond a flat surface and a set of pieces, and it rewarded the kind of strategic thinking that military culture valued. Whether that connection between game and warfare was more symbolic than practical is debatable, but samurai didn't need to justify it strategically. They played because it was engaging, because it passed hours, and because winning mattered to men for whom competition was a daily social reality. Go, the older and arguably more complex of the two classic Japanese board games, carried even more cultural prestige. By the Edo period, the Tokugawa shogunate formalized Go to the point of creating official schools and granting stipends to the top players. Senior players held ranks, received government support, and competed in matches that attracted serious attention from the ruling class. For a samurai with leisure time and sufficient rank to access refined social spaces, Go was not merely entertainment, it was a marker of cultivation, a demonstration that the mind operated with patience and depth. An Edo period samurai who played Go well could claim a kind of intellectual seriousness that sat alongside his martial identity without contradicting it. Then there was gambling, less respectable, far more common. Dice games circulated through military camps and garrison posts throughout the medieval and early modern periods, despite repeated prohibitions. The regulations against gambling among samurai were issued frequently enough to suggest the practice never disappeared, which is precisely what repeated bans usually indicate. Men waiting for orders, men bored in provincial postings, men who had nothing to wager except their next stipend payment, they gambled. The thumbnail image of a samurai leaning over a shogi board with dice scattered nearby captures something real. Dice weren't foreign objects in samurai spaces, they were part of the texture of downtime. Poetry was another matter entirely, and treating it simply as a leisure activity undersells how thoroughly it was embedded in samurai identity and social function. The writing of waka, a classical Japanese poetic form, and later haiku and linked verse in the form of renga, was not a hobby samurai pursued the way a modern person might pick up a guitar. It was, for many, an expected social competency. High-ranking warriors exchanged poems as part of diplomatic and interpersonal communication. A lord might compose verse to mark a significant event and expect his retainers to respond in kind. The ability to write a serviceable poem was in certain social circles as necessary as the ability to handle a weapon. This doesn't mean all samurai were gifted poets. Many were not, but the expectation existed across much of the warrior class throughout the medieval period, and it intensified during the Edo era, when samurai were increasingly administrators and cultural figures rather than active soldiers. The brush was part of the identity. Calligraphy, the slow, disciplined practice of writing characters with a loaded brush on quality paper, was practiced not only for communication, but as a form of training in concentration and physical control. The same sustained attention required to draw a bow correctly is required to move a brush with intention. Whether samurai articulated it in those terms or not, the two practices shared a structural logic. Music appeared in samurai culture primarily through the shakuhachi, a vertical bamboo flute, and the biwa, a pear-shaped lute associated with wandering musicians in certain Buddhist traditions. Neither instrument was universal among samurai, but the shakuhachi in particular carried associations with meditation and breath control that aligned it with military discipline in a way that made its adoption by certain warrior practitioners feel natural rather than contradictory. Some samurai took the instrument seriously enough to seek formal instruction. Others played casually, alone, in the kind of unscheduled evening hours that a garrison life produced in abundance. The relationship between samurai and the natural world deserves more space than it typically gets. Hunting was practiced widely among the warrior class and carried both practical and ceremonial dimensions. Falconry, hunting with trained birds of prey, was particularly prestigious, associated with the highest levels of the warrior aristocracy and regulated by sumptuary customs that tied the practice to rank. The Tokugawa shoguns hunted extensively. Lower-ranking samurai who could access appropriate land and equipment hunted deer, boar, and smaller game. Hunting sharpened physical alertness and required coordination, stamina, and knowledge of terrain. It was also an excuse to leave the castle or the compound and spend time in the open air, which, given the social confinement of Edo period samurai life, carried its own quiet value. Fishing sat at the opposite emotional register, patient, solitary, physically undemanding. Surviving accounts and literary references suggest it was a common activity among samurai who had access to rivers or coastal areas and a day without formal obligation. The appeal was partly practical, as fresh fish supplemented a rice-heavy diet, but the practice carried overtones of contemplation and withdrawal that resonated with both Buddhist sensibility and the Confucian ideal of the retired scholar. A samurai alone with a line in water wasn't escaping his identity, he was expressing one facet of it. The formal practice of no theater and its related arts moved through samurai culture like a current that ran deeper the higher up the hierarchy you looked. No performance, with its slow movement, masked actors, and layered poetic texts, was elevated to near sacred status by Ashikaga period warrior rulers and remained central to high samurai cultural identity through the Edo period. Senior samurai were expected to appreciate No, to understand its conventions, and in many cases to participate in amateur performance, learning the chants, the dances, the prescribed gestures. It was not casual entertainment. It was, in the social logic of the period, part of becoming a complete person of warrior status. Below No in prestige, but closer to actual daily experience for many samurai, was Kyogen, the comic interlude form performed between No plays. Where No demanded austerity and symbolic interpretation, Kyogen offered physical comedy, recognizable human situations, and relief. Samurai watched both. The combination of the elevated and the earthy in the same theatrical evening mirrors something about samurai culture more broadly, a persistent coexistence of formal refinement and lived reality that the sanitized samurai image tends to erase. Drinking existed in this space too, and with less ceremony than later idealization suggested. Sake circulated at gatherings, at poetry sessions, at the informal socializing that followed formal duties. The boundaries between a poetry gathering and a drinking party were not always distinct. Samurai culture produced detailed protocols for formal drinking ceremonies that were beautiful and precisely ordered. It also produced warriors who drank too much in garrison and caused problems. Both things were part of the same world. Physical training during non-combat periods carried a different quality than the image of samurai constant martial preparation usually suggests. The major weapons traditions, Kenjutsu for sword technique, Kyudo for archery, Sojutsu for spear fighting, were practiced, but practice intensity varied significantly by rank, period, and individual motivation.
During the long peace of the Edo period, as the likelihood of actual combat diminished generation by generation, martial training for many samurai became more formalized, more ceremonial, more about preserving and transmitting tradition than about developing genuine combat readiness. The ryu, the martial lineage or school, became a social and cultural institution as much as a practical training system. Belonging to a respected ryu conferred status. Advancing through its ranks was a form of social achievement. The dojo, the training hall, was a space where samurai hierarchies were reproduced and reinforced through physical practice, regardless of whether that practice would ever be called upon in an actual fight.
Sumo wrestling occupied a particular social position. It was a popular spectator event that attracted audiences across class lines, but samurai engagement with it went beyond watching. Wrestling traditions with distinct technical systems existed within warrior culture itself, and some samurai trained in them seriously. Beyond its athletic function, sumo carried religious associations through Shinto ceremonial connections that added a ritual dimension distinct from simple athletic competition. Shrine grounds hosted wrestling events tied to agricultural and religious calendars, and the patronage of powerful lords was essential to sustaining the professional wrestlers who emerged in the major urban centers by the Edo period. A samurai attending a sumo event in Edo was participating in a public cultural moment that mixed class registers in ways that the rigidly hierarchical social system of the period otherwise resisted. The match itself leveled the distinction between observer and observed in a way that few other public entertainments managed. The architecture of the spaces where samurai spent their downtime shaped how that time felt. In castle towns, a mid-ranking samurai might inhabit a residence with a small garden, tatami-floored rooms, and sliding screens that opened onto a narrow courtyard. The space was modest by the standards of the castle itself, but maintained specific aesthetic requirements, a certain quality of simplicity that reflected Zen-influenced sensibility without being austere to the point of discomfort. Garden maintenance, which in the Japanese aesthetic tradition required sustained attention and constituted a real craft, was an activity sub-samurai took seriously in residence. Tending a small garden, controlling which stones sat at what angle, which moss was allowed to spread and where, was contemplative labor that left the hands occupied and the mind quiet. The principles behind Japanese garden design in the warrior residential tradition were not decorative in the modern sense, they were organizational. A properly maintained garden expressed the occupant's capacity to impose considered order on living material, which was, in its own quiet way, a demonstration of the same qualities demanded in military and administrative life. The aesthetic and the functional were not opposed, they operated on the same logic. Reading occupied samurai who had access to texts, which by the Edo period meant a significant portion of the class in castle towns with library access or the resources to acquire books. Military histories, Chinese classical texts, Buddhist sutras, agricultural treatises, practical administrative manuals, samurai read widely. The stereotype of the sword-obsessed warrior with no intellectual interests reflects a small subset of actual practice. Many samurai in settled periods were functionally bureaucrats who spent their days on paperwork and their evenings on books, with a sword hanging on a rack in the corner that they rarely, if ever, touched. The Confucian intellectual tradition, which the Tokugawa period actively promoted as the ideological framework for a stable, hierarchically organized society, placed genuine value in literary and scholarly cultivation. A samurai who read classical Chinese texts and could discuss them with reasonable fluency was not merely an intellectual eccentric, he was fulfilling a version of the Edo period expectation for what a samurai of good standing should be. The military identity and the scholarly identity were supposed to reinforce each other. Whether individual samurai found them compatible in practice was another matter, but the expectation shaped how they spent their time. Travel, when it occurred outside of official duty, took samurai to temples, pilgrimage routes, and occasionally to the post towns along the major routes, where a degree of anonymity allowed behavior that castle town social scrutiny would have complicated. The Tokaido Road connecting Edo to Kyoto was, by the mature Edo period, a busy commercial route lined with tea houses, inns, and entertainments that served a socially mixed clientele.
Samurai travelers on the road occupied a legally distinct space from their everyday social position, and some used that distinction. What this accumulation of actual practice reveals is a portrait that resists the singular image. The samurai who played shogi by lamplight until midnight was the same man who drilled with a spear at dawn. The samurai who composed a careful verse in response to his lord's poem was the same man who would, if circumstances demanded, be expected to apply violence with professional effectiveness. These activities weren't contradictions. They were, in the social and psychological logic of samurai culture, parts of a coherent whole, a life organized around readiness, refinement, and the maintenance of status in a world where status was both inherited and performed. The game board in the thumbnail sits beside a kabuto helmet. That placement isn't accidental or decorative. It captures something real. The helmet is there because the warrior never fully left that identity, even at rest. The game is there because the mind required occupation, because the hours between campaigns were long, and because being a samurai was not a continuous state of martial intensity, but a whole life lived within a particular set of social and material conditions that included, alongside the sword and the armor, the shogi piece moved in lamplight, the poem composed before sleep, the fishing line held over still water, and the dice rolled when no one of consequence was watching. That is the samurai the records reveal if you look past the legend. Not less interesting for being human, considerably more. If this raised questions about how samurai spent their time in specific periods, or how these practices changed across the centuries, that history goes deeper than a single video can hold, and some of the most surprising details are still waiting.